Once upon a time, stories of fantasy. People suffering with OCD aren't living a fantasy. Even though there are a lot of myths that go around obsessive compulsive disorder, their stories are real. These are stories from the OCD side. Real people, real stories, brought to you by FamilyOCD.com and invisiblewheelchair.com. We want your story. Go to invisiblewheelchair.com and contact us to tell us your story here. OCD is real. OCD treatments are real. OCD recovery is real. And so are these stories. So, Sophie, thank you so much for being part of the Invisible Wheelchair's Stories from the OCD Side. I welcome you and I thank you for wanting to tell your story.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk about my experiences and hopefully help other people who might be suffering in a similar way.
So let's get right into it, Sophie. If you're willing to share your story, let's tell that story now.
Hello, I'm Sophie Pulley. I'm 34 and I live in a town called Rugby in Warwickshire in the UK. I have suffered with OCD since I was 4 or 5 and it's always been there since then. I also suffer with generalized anxiety disorder. I remember my first symptoms of OCD was when my mum would put me in bed at night. I would repeatedly make her open and close my curtains until it felt right, which is a term I'm sure lots of people will be able to relate to. And even when she wouldn't do that anymore, I would do it myself for goodness knows how long before I'd actually lie down and go to sleep. I've had so many different forms of OCD. Hand washing has always been a very prominent one and it still is now. I've really struggled with intrusive thoughts. When I was younger, I started having very vivid, violent, intrusive thoughts, always revolved around my family or people that I loved, that I found very, very disturbing and very hard to deal with. And when I was 20 years old, I was sent to a psychiatrist. And going into the office that day, I remember it so clearly. I genuinely believe that they were going to lock me up and never let me back out. That was a real fear that I felt. And when I told this guy about these intrusive thoughts, he didn't even bat an eyelid. You know, he just kind of went, yeah, that's OCD. You know, that's an intrusive thought. And it was like such a flippant response for how much anxiety I felt going to that appointment. I mean, it was a game changer. And then I moved to London for a short time and I suffered from really horrendous health anxiety and intrusive thoughts. I was absolutely convinced that I was going to have a heart attack, phoning my mum like, I don't even know how many times a day, asking for reassurance that this wasn't going to happen. And for some reason, she was like God to me. It had to be her that said, no, you're fine. It didn't need to be a doctor. It had to be her. She was like my reassurance. As I've moved into my 30s, I went through a really difficult experience in my life to do with paedophilia. And I started suffering from intrusive thoughts revolved around that. And I've found that so difficult to deal with. And that was happening on the build up to the pandemic, which didn't help because you're suddenly left on your own to deal with everything. I'd say as I've got older, I still have compulsions and I still do all that, but it's become like more like pure O in my head, arguing with myself and dealing with it that way. That's my story kind of in a nutshell.
Okay, because you mentioned it even when you wrote to me about the pandemic being one that stepped it up. And, you know, I'd kind of like to emphasize a little bit more on that because we talked about before we recorded, you know, we have a lot of people going around saying, well, you know, the pandemic must be easy for those with OCD. And you found it just the opposite. And same with us. But So tell me a little bit more about, where the pandemic started playing into it and what's happened because of the pandemic.
I mean, there's nothing quite like a worldwide pandemic to aggravate a condition which is about feeling in control. So how people would find that easy with OCD, I don't know. I think the biggest thing that I struggled with was suddenly the world was silent around you and there was no distraction from the OCD. So whereas in normal day life, the OCD is prevalent and it's there most of the time, there are moments of distraction, whether that's family or work or relationships or friendships. Whereas in the pandemic, all of a sudden you are on your own or with a very small amount of people in four walls, and you don't know what's going to happen. Nobody knew what's going to happen. So that's bound to aggravate anxiety. It was very hard accessing help because all of a sudden a greater volume of people needed help, not just people with OCD, but all sorts of mental health conditions, whether they'd had them before or they developed them because of what was happening.
You brought up a really good point about the distraction factor. I never thought about the world became very silent all of a sudden, really, in a way, and I hadn't thought about it because I know for myself, my oldest daughter, when she was going through it, she, when silence would happen for her, 100 messages would start ripping through her head. I think she even described it kind of that way. They would just viciously loop through her head. So I had never thought about that as far as the pandemic. So that's an interesting point. Plus, you brought up, one of the big things about OCD is OCD tends to live in the what if world. And here again, same thing. That's a wonderful point. Thank you for bringing that up, though, because it was a what if world. What's going to happen? What if the pandemic really gets, what if this and, so that's really, thank you for bringing that up. That was something I never thought about and had never brought up to the audience. So do you feel like you've learned something from OCD, from what you've gone through in this fight with OCD, I guess you'd say?
Yeah, I think to be honest with you, it wasn't until the pandemic and I hit a really, really low point. I didn't really appreciate to that point how much of my life was dictated to by OCD. I always thought the OCD was more, I knew intrusive thoughts existed, but I didn't know to what extent. And obviously I knew that the wanting things to be in a certain order, tapping, hand washing was all stuff. But I didn't realize how much it dictates your life, not just those things, but work, relationships, how you deal with friendships, how you deal with grief, change, all this stuff. And I kind of was so low that I was like, it wasn't a case of I don't want to be here. I just didn't want to be there, exist how I was feeling. So I was like, I'm going to go on the opposite and I'm going to educate myself as much as I can. I'm going to listen to things. I'm going to read things. I started doing clinical trials for people who are trying to develop new treatments for OCD, like telling them as much as I could about my own experiences. And I'm not saying that the OCD is not there because it's still very prevalent, but it kind of turned it on its head. It turned a negative into a positive, because if you're going to go through something like that, you may as well use it to other people's benefit, so they can develop new things. And that's been really powerful in moving forward for me and dealing with things.
You're raising some great stuff here, because one of the questions I tend to ask, and I didn't write it down this time because I'm always leery of asking, but can you find a positive coming from OCD? And you really just brought that up, that you did find something positive out of it.
Yeah, it's hard because I think sometimes you just get so desperately low with it that is the answer, to try and turn it on its head. And I know I'm saying this like it's easy. It's not easy. And it's not easy doing these clinical trials and research papers, because you have to, in order for the doctors, researchers to get the most out of it, you have to be really brutally honest, and you have to talk about things that you don't want to talk about. But there's even power in that. Being able to talk about it is like like fighting the OCD to the best you possibly can, because you're saying, I don't care what you've told me, all these things that I am, or you're saying that I'm not these things, and I'm going to turn it on its head and make a positive out of it. I never used to tell anybody about my intrusive thoughts because I was so like ashamed of them and filled with guilt and embarrassment and the more I talk about it, the easier it is to deal with. 100%.
Part of that, I think, too, is somebody else in a recent interview talked about, I asked him that question about positive.
Yeah.
And he said we kind of came up with the idea that it's a fine line in a way. You know, what I heard you saying was that you got into researching and looking up and educating that can almost become an obsession itself, you know.
Yeah.
Then you got to have more information, you know. So it sounds like you did a good job of holding that line, though, and not going obsessive with it, which I think is that's where the positive really plays, is right there. If you can do that kind of thing and hold the line without going over into an obsessive place. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't personally find forums very helpful for me, because I find that sometimes people use them for reassurance, and obviously you're not meant to reassure someone with OCD. You can reassure them that it's the OCD making them feel how they are, but not telling them, oh, you know, my OCD is telling me I'm this. No, you're not that. You'd never be that, because that's like someone is trying to recover from drugs and giving them a little bit of drugs to recover, then they so I kind of put the line for me at forums, but other people may find forums really helpful. It's all a personal journey. There's no like set black or white answer for anybody. These are just things that have, you know, helped me. I definitely in the past used to kind of follow the theory of nothing's to be feared if you understand it. So when I was having health anxiety, I'd read articles and articles and articles and articles about heart attacks. And when I was struggling with, you know, child abuse, intrusive thoughts, I would watch documentaries on paedophiles. What makes a paedophile? What are the characteristics? You know, and I realized after a while that I was just feeding the OCD. I was giving it more ideas of how to hurt me and attack me. So there's definitely a fine line in OCD, and trying to find that line is hard.
Oh yeah, it's very deep. It's very, very deep in that line. Yeah. What advice would you give someone that maybe just finding out about it, just getting into realizing that what they have? What would you tell them? What would be the thing you would advise them to do?
I mean, hopefully that person would have at least one person in their life that they could be open and honest about their disorder with, because that's really powerful, being able to talk to someone and, you know, they nod along and they don't judge and they don't try and fix you or work it out too much. They just listen. I definitely think seeking support groups is massively beneficial, as long as you go along with the understanding that support groups won't fix you. You know, that's not the purpose of a support group. But sitting in a room with other people who can completely relate to what you're going through, even though their compulsions and obsessions might be different from yours, is so powerful. Like so powerful, because I think one of the worst things about OCD is, and any mental health condition, is how alone it makes you feel. Even when you've got, you know, 10 loving, supportive people around you, you feel so alone in it, especially when it's bad. So, I mean, there's a lot of support out there now, a lot more compared to when I was younger, and other people who I know who are older than me, and it wasn't even recognised as a condition, you know, 50 odd years ago. And reading, not necessarily forums or things like that, but there's some brilliant books out there about people's experiences of OCDs, obviously podcasts, certain charities. I think educating yourself on it is massively powerful.
That's wonderful. Very good advice. I appreciate that so much. And I very much appreciate your vulnerability. You express some things that that are tough to get out and to open to everybody's ears. And I really appreciate that and honor you for that, because that's like I said, I understand, not from being having OCD myself, but from what I've gone through with my two daughters, how important it is to get it out, but how hard it is to do that. So thank you so much for doing that. I know what you've said so far. You brought up some great stuff that's going to inspire somebody else to make it through this too. So thank you for being part of this.
That's okay. Thank you.
So that is our story for this podcast. Remember, we want your story told here. If you want to tell us your success story, or just want to tell us where you're at, simply go to www.invisiblewheelchair.com, then click on the Tell Us Your Story on the top left side, or just click the Contact Don button on the right side towards the bottom. We want to give you a voice to your story. Until next time, keep working on your story for a happily ever after ending.